Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Hello everyone and greetings to you all from Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and Te Whanganui a Tara, Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So before I begin my actual talk, I'd first like to thank Professor Denise Neary for inviting me to present as part of this Royal Irish Academy of Music guest lecture series. Denise and I first met in person a few years ago at Dublin Castle at a concert entitled Rediscovering Irish State Music. And I'm very grateful to her for this opportunity to talk about some of my research that's related to that same theme. So thanks very much, Denise. I'd also like to thank Peter Whelan, who was the instigator and musical director of that particular concert, and who has a particular passion for exploring and championing neglected and forgotten music of the Baroque era, including music composed for and performed in Ireland in the 18th century. Apologies that my talk is a recording. Denise and I decided that giving a talk via Zoom at 2 o'clock in the morning New Zealand time was quite an ask, but please don't hesitate to email me with any questions or comments that you might have, and Denise will let you know my contact details. As you can see on this slide, the title of my talk today is Matthew Dubourg, Redmond, Simpson, and the Accumulation of Wealth, Professional Musicians in 18th Century Ireland and England. And it was really because of Peter Whelan that I first started to look at Dubourg's career more closely. When Peter asked me to write some liner notes for the Irish Baroque Orchestra's wonderful 2019 CD of music by Dubourg. Now, Dubourg had previously crossed my path briefly in the course of my research on the Hungarian-born German music director and composer John Sigismund Kusa, or Johann Sigismund Kusa. He spent the last 20 years of his life working in Dublin, having been appointed chief composer and music master of the Irish state music in 1716. And this is just the title page or the cover of my book on Kusa, published by the Boydell Press, and also my edition of the 3 known surviving of more than 20 serenatas that Kusa composed for performance, mainly at Dublin Castle in the early 18th century. In 1723, Philip Percival, who held the position of director and supervisor of the Irish state music, was successful in engaging the young violinist Matthew Dubourg as a member of the orchestra based at Dublin Castle, proclaiming to his brother John Percival in a letter that Dubourg was a better master in his way than any of the king's musicians in England, and is really the best performer of an Englishman that has ever yet been known. 5 years later, in 1728, after the death of John Sigismund Kusa, Dubourg took over from him and was appointed chief composer and master of His Majesty's music, attending the state in Ireland. Reportedly, after his violin teacher, Francesco Gemignani, had declined the offer, his Roman Catholicism apparently making him ineligible for the post. By the early 1720s, if not earlier, Dubourg had been leading orchestras at concerts in London presented by some of England's foremost musicians, and he continued to divide his time between Dublin and London. His celebrity had developed to such an extent that he had started to be mentioned occasionally in poetry in flattering terms in both countries. One such example comes from the English poet Henry Carey, who in his collection of poems on several occasions, published in London in 1719, included a short piece to Matthew Dubourg at Dublin. So fine a genius and so great a hand, nature and art, Dubourg, are at a stand. On thee they have bestowed their richest store. Can we expect, or canst thou wish for more? A slightly earlier example appeared in James Arbuckle's Dublin Weekly Journal in September 1725, in a poem entitled Damon, a city eclogue written to a gentleman in the country. And this is just an excerpt from that poem. No fashionable dress can charm my sight, nor music, even Dubourg's, thy ear invited. O mourn, Dubourg, no more the crowded house shall fill thy purse and all thy music rouse. So what particularly interested me about both these examples are the references to riches and to Dubourg filling his purse. Of course, in Carey's poem, the riches are Dubourg's natural musical gifts, bestowed from birth by nature and art, but presumably helped along by some diligent work on Dubourg's part. However, in Damon, a city eclogue, the wealth in question is pointedly material wealth, with Dubourg's purse being literally filled by sizable audiences at local venues in Dublin. But was Dubourg in fact a wealthy man? What type of riches might he have had in store by the end of his working life? Innate musical talent and a considerable fortune, or the former alone? It's reasonably well known that by the end of George Frederick Handel's life, he had accumulated significant wealth, with £17,500 at the Bank of England at the time of his death in 1759, plus a substantial and valuable collection of art that was auctioned off the following year. As such, Handel has been held up as an extraordinary case by scholars such as Robert D. Hume, who's calculated that, quote, a huge majority of participants in the production of culture in the 18th century, that is, writers, actors, musicians, and painters, had incomes at or below the lower end of the middling sort. And that, furthermore, a substantial number would have fallen into the realm of the labouring poor, end quote. Hume lists Handel, together with actor, playwright, and theatre manager David Garrick, to the right of Handel on this slide, painter Joshua Reynolds, and the author Anne Radcliffe, as a member of an elite group of artists whose earnings place them in the top 3% of Britain's population in economic terms. In comparison to Handel, though, rather less is known of the economic circumstances or day-to-day financial realities of the majority of professional musicians who worked in 18th century Europe. Even for John Sigismund Kusa, regarding whom his so-called commonplace book, with more than 450 pages, provides a wealth of everyday information, little is known regarding his overall fiscal situation, beyond the details provided in his brief will made shortly before his death in Dublin in 1727. Kusa left the majority of his belongings to be divided equally between his wife and 2 daughters, all of whom were living in Germany, with the exception of his kitchen utensils and a bed in the kitchen, which he left to Mary Mulhall, presumably his housekeeper or a domestic servant, plus £20 left to his sister in Stuttgart, and all his musical papers and compositions to his 2 nephews, also in Germany. According to the British National Archives currency converter, £20 is worth roughly 2,700 euros in today's money. A further reference to Matthew Dubourg also served to increase my interest in 18th century musicians' potential for accumulating wealth. On the 4th of May, 1727, as reported in both newspapers and the proceedings of the Old Bailey, now available online, in the early hours of the morning, not long after midnight, Dubourg was crossing London's Lincoln's Inn Fields, coming from the theatre there, when he was attacked by 3 men. including Philip Thomas and Christopher Rawlins. As Dubourg stated at their trial, "They came up to me and slung me down, after which they tied both my hands and legs, and one of them, that seemed like a butcher in a white waistcoat, had a knife in his hand and said if I offered to make a noise, he would cut my throat." The trio stole roughly £34 from Dubourg, approximately €5,700 in value today. But only Rawlins was committed to Newgate for the offence. This incident suggests that presumably, like Handel, Dubourg had at least the possibility of becoming a wealthy man from his concert giving and other musical activities. Although, of course, a fair proportion of the £34 may have been destined for paying musicians or other creditors involved with the performance at the theatre. But was Handel really so alone in being an extraordinary case in terms of his financial success as a musician in 18th century Britain? Even in the face of a probable dearth of relevant primary source material, this possibility seemed worth investigating in the case of Matthew Dubourg. I'd like to begin by providing a little bit of background on Dubourg. As Benjamin Victor's witty epigram suggests, Dubourg was chiefly celebrated during his own lifetime as a performer. An extraordinarily gifted violinist, his playing both delighted and at times astonished audiences. He also appears to have been highly sought after as a teacher by both men and women. One of the latter, a Miss Plunkett, gave a series of public concerts in London in 1744, advertising herself as a scholar of Mr. Dubourg's, lately arrived from Dublin. She performed several solos and concertos on the violin. Dubourg's family background is somewhat shrouded in mystery. He was reportedly the natural son of a Mr. Isaac, a highly successful dancer and dancing master active at the court of Queen Anne, who also performed in theatres, gave private dancing lessons to the elite of London society, and published copies of the dance that he choreographed each year for the Queen's birthday ball. Recent research by Jennifer Thorpe has revealed that Mr. Isaac was probably Edward or Edmund Isaac, a Catholic dancing master who lived for a time in the London parish of St. Clement Danes. The identity of Dubourg's mother is even more shadowy. According to the Irish antiquarian and writer Joseph Cooper Walker, she was, quote, an Irish woman, end quote. Dubourg clearly excelled on his chosen instrument from an early age. While still a child, probably in around 1712, he performed a solo at the celebrated concert series hosted by Thomas Britton in Clerkenwell, standing upon a joint stool, but so terribly awed at the sight of so splendid an assembly that he was near falling to the ground. He then went on to study with renowned violinist and composer Gimignani, who had settled in England in 1714. Soon Dubourg was appearing regularly in public as a soloist, including at his own benefit concerts, which took place in London every year between 1714 and 1720. His long-standing celebrity was evidently established early on. According to John Hawkins, a picture of Dubourg painted when he was a boy was a key feature in the large music room of a Mrs. Martin, a rich Dutch woman who frequently hosted concerts during the capital's winter season. Dubourg was primarily associated with the Italian music fashionable in early 18th century England and Ireland. But while still a teenager, he'd also begun to showcase his own compositions. Newspaper advertisements reveal, for example, that his benefit concert at Drury Lane's Theatre Royal on the 8th of April 1720 featured several concertos and solos of his own composition. Rather than publishing these works, Dubourg reserved them for himself to play, Sadly, this has meant that only one has survived, Dubourg's Concerto in D major. Somehow, a manuscript copy of this four-movement work, ascribed to Signor Dubourg, as seen on the first page of the catalogued collection, has found its way into the music collection of the renowned musical establishment of the Electoral Court in Dresden, where it remains today at the Saxon State and University Library. And this work is recorded on the Irish Baroque Orchestra's CD. I would play you a little bit, but the sound quality over Zoom is pretty appalling, and I don't want to put you off what's a really great CD. Following his 1728 appointment as chief composer and music master at Dublin Castle, Dubourg appears to have commuted between Ireland and England for the remainder of his career, since according to Hawkins, the duties of his employment did not require his constant residence in Dublin or London. Certainly, it was reported in London newspapers in 1731 that he had obtained leave of His Grace the Duke of Dorset to reside here next winter in Ireland, to the real joy of all true lovers of harmony. From at least 1748, Dubourg appears to have held official positions in both Dublin and London, with the printed libretto of his 1748 Dublin Ode for King George II's birthday, adding the title of Master of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales's chamber music to his Irish post of Chief Composer and Master of the Music. Hawkins also notes that Dubourg had given music lessons to the Prince of Wales as well as to his brother, the Duke of Cumberland. In September 1761, Dubourg was appointed Master of the Queen's Chamber Concert, also known as Her Majesty's Band of Music, or alternatively as the Royal Family's Chamber Concert. This newspaper listing in 1762 shows the ensemble's 10 members as Dubourg at the head of 4 violinists, 2 oboists, including his son-in-law, Redmond Simpson, a viola player, a cellist, a double bassist, and a harpsichordist. It's worth noting that the Irish State Band of Musicians appears to have been roughly the same size as this, with Philip Percival noting in 1723 that the ensemble included a good violoncello and bassoon, with most of the rest of the musicians sure and ready performers on several instruments. As for its standard of performance, by the time Handel visited Dublin in 1741 to 42, he was able to report back to Charles Jennens regarding his performances at Neil's new music hall in Fishamble Street. The instruments, they are really excellent, Mr. Dubourg being at the head of them, and the music sounds delightfully in this charming room. As was also the case for Handel, as argued by David Hunter, it's clear that Dubourg's professional activities mixed freelance opportunities, such as public concert giving and teaching, with significant patronage, provided largely in the form of permanent salaried appointments at both the Vice-Regal Court in Dublin and the Royal Court in London. By the year of his death in 1759, Handel was receiving £600 in guaranteed annual pensions from the royal family. From early on in his career, Dubourg seems to have mixed pleasure with serious networking, of the type that had the capacity to lead to such elevated patronage. In September 1718, for example, he'd taken part in some music making with amateurs in Bath, where he played with Philip Percival, who wrote to his brother John, later the Earl of Egmont, "Dubourg, the famous violinist, is here, and so we have a little music, which will create you some trouble, for I left some things behind that I now want. There are 7 green books bound in green and gold paper covers, which I must desire you to send to me. 6 of them are a set of concertis, and 1 is a serenata of Wilderer's. It may also have been Philip Percival who first invited Dubourg to visit Ireland, since in December 1721, in a further letter to his brother, this time from his home in Dublin, Philip reported on preparations for a concert to be given by his amateur music club, noting that Dubourg has not failed us one night, and you must believe he is no small addition to the performance. It was definitely Philip who, as director and supervisor of the Irish State Music, engaged the young violinist Dubourg as a member of the Dublin Castle Orchestra in 1723. Details of the exact amounts Dubourg earned through the means of aristocratic patronage are somewhat sketchy, unfortunately, particularly for his established positions in Ireland. In addition to holding the position of chief composer and master of music there from 1728, by 1760 he'd added the position of kettle drummer to his responsibilities, although he presumably paid someone else to undertake this role as needed. Dubourg surely received an annual salary for his chief role at Dublin Castle, hopefully a decent one. However, as far as I'm aware, the only surviving record of payment for his official duties in Ireland is a receipt for £20 held in the British Library, signed by Dubourg, to defray the expenses of His Majesty's birthday music performed at Dublin Castle in October 1752. And, as with the stolen takings from the Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre in 1727, this amount, £20, presumably went some way to paying the wages of the performers and others on that occasion. We know slightly more regarding Dubourg's regular earnings in England, since in 1761, Lloyd's Evening Post and British Chronicle reported that Mr. Dubourg is made master to Her Majesty's Band of Music with a salary of £200 a year. This is roughly 24,000 euros in today's money. Somewhat mysteriously, Dubourg also appears to have been a recipient of an equal sum of money since March 1748, when, according to Faulkner's Dublin Journal, following the death of one widow Barry of Arbour Hill, Dublin, in the 85th year of her age, Dubourg have got £200 a year, which she bequeathed him by will. Further research remains to be undertaken to identify this wealthy widow and speculate as to why she left Dubourg this substantial ongoing legacy. As noted by Brian Boydell in his Dublin musical calendar, 1700 to 1760, only 2 months earlier, in January 1748, the Dublin Journal had advertised a sale by auction at Dubourg's house in Henry Street, Dublin. The advertisement specified a curious collection of paintings and landscape history, etc., mostly originals by the greatest masters, as well as household furniture, carpets, curtains, and other items. By the following week, Dubourg was performing at the Music Hall in Fishamble Street for the last time this season. While on the face of it, this would seem to suggest that Dubourg was selling up and intending to leave Ireland for good, he was in fact back performing in Dublin by early November at the latest, probably even by late October. It may be significant that his close colleague, Benjamin Victor, author of the texts for many of Dubourg's festive odes composed for Dublin Castle, also left Dublin around the same time in February of that year, relinquishing his management of the Theatre Royal in Smock Alley. And if you remember, in 1743, Victor had penned the highly laudatory poem on Mr. Dubourg's excellent performance on the violin. To date, I found no reference whatsoever to Dubourg having been in London between February 1748, when he appears to have sold a significant portion of his belongings in Dublin, and late October that same year. I'd like to speculate that Dubourg travelled to the continent for a period of some months, covering the summer when travelling would have been easier, supported financially by the proceeds of this auction and the recent ongoing bequest from the widow Barry. The sole piece of evidence indicating that Dubourg made such a trip at some point over the course of the next 20 years, prior to his death in 1767, can be found in the title of the printed auction catalogue of the genuine and valuable collection of Italian, French, Flemish, and Dutch paintings, the property of the late Mr. Dubourg, deceased, first musician to His Majesty, selected from sundry capital collections, both abroad and at home. And sorry, I don't have the image of the title page of the auction catalogue, only this newspaper advert for it. So this auction took place at Christie's Great Auction Room in London on the 11th and 12th of March, 1768, on the order of Dubourg's widow Frances, his sole executor, and who'd been left all of his effects of what kind soever. In all, this auction comprised 211 lots, many containing multiple items. So 15 lots, for example, contain a total of 102 miniature paintings. Also included alongside the works of art was a Rooker's harpsichord. The majority of the lots contained paintings, from full lengths to the miniatures I just mentioned, but there were also items of sculpture and some prints. In keeping with the ranked hierarchies of art genres of the day, Dubourg's collection featured large numbers of landscape and history paintings, with a much smaller selection of portraits and genre paintings, so still lifes, characteristic scenes, so-called conversations and the like. In these respects, Dubourg's choice of paintings displays a strong resemblance to that of Handel, whose collection was auctioned 7 years earlier in 1760. Although Dubourg owned many more paintings on religious subjects than Handel had done, including a Virgin and Christ by Rubens that sold for £48, 16 shillings, and this is almost 5,000 euros today. Thomas McGeary has speculated that the relative lack of religious paintings in Handel's collection probably reflects a Protestant's fear of idolatry, with Protestant churchmen and some art collectors suspicious of sacred images. So it's quite interesting that Dubourg had so many paintings of religious subjects. Compared to Dubourg's collection with 211 lots, which raised a total sum of approximately £701, and that's very close to 70,000 euros today. The number of items at the auction of Handel's artworks was much, much smaller, comprising around only 70 paintings and 10 prints sold in 67 lots compared to 211 lots at Dubourg's auction. The prices of items sold aren't known for Handel's auction, unfortunately. According to a list found in Kusa's commonplace book, Kusa, on the other hand, owned only 23 paintings, and this is just one page from the inventory of his possessions in his house in Dublin, starting at the top of the page here with Kusa's parlour. These included 6 portraits, all people known personally to Kusa. Neither Handel's nor Dubourg's collections were particularly rich in portraiture, although it's possible that these paintings had been given away as gifts prior to auction. Dubourg's collection included portraits of Charles II by Peter Lely, Frederick V of Denmark, Gilbert Burnet, the Bishop of Salisbury, the current king, George III, and Edward Harley III, Earl of Oxford. A further 15 portraits of unidentified figures, some just heads, included works by Rembrandt, Gottfried Kneller, Titian, Van Dyck, and Balthazar Denon. As the 18th century progressed, paintings and prints were increasingly popular as interior decorations. Indeed, as David Ormrod has shown, in London by this time, the market for paintings had expanded to accommodate a more socially diverse range of consumers, in which clergymen, gentry, professional people, and other middling sorts outnumbered aristocratic buyers. The same was evidently true of Ireland. Nevertheless, as pointed out by Thomas McGeary and other scholars, most notably Ian Pearce, attending auctions and viewing paintings in artists' showrooms was also a regular element of London's elite social life. Collecting and buying at auction were a means of exhibiting good taste and judicious use of wealth, rather than mere luxurious display of riches. The prestige of Dubourg's court appointments no doubt brought him into contact with members of the elite classes of both Ireland and England, who also collected art. But given the considerable extent of Dubourg's art collection, it seems likely that he also mixed socially and or as a customer with individual painters. A notice in London's Public Advertiser in February 1756 appears to point in this direction. Whereas several of the nobility and gentry may remember to have seen Dominicus van der Smisson's painter on the broad pavement in St. Martin's Lane, next door to a colour shop, several pictures of his own painting, which he had brought with him from beyond sea. And whereas these pictures, particularly four cased ones, were generally admired, it has been maliciously reported, to the great prejudices of Mr. van der Smisson, that the above said pictures were not his own work. This is therefore to inform the public that the said Dominicus van der Smisson has drawn Mr. Dubourg's picture in the same style and high finished manner as the above mentioned case pieces, which may be seen by the curious at Mr. van der Smisson's lodgings in St. Martin's Lane. So, was Matthew Dubourg a wealthy man? Due to COVID-19, I haven't been able to investigate whether he had accounts with banks in Ireland or the Bank of England. However, it seems from the evidence presented above, drawn from what is known of his regular earnings and the value of his art collection at his death, that the answer would have to be yes. Can Dubourg thus be counted alongside Handel among Robert Hume's extraordinary cases? And might other examples yet be found among the ranks of 18th century musicians? While searching for documentary evidence concerning Dubourg, I came across a selection of similar material relating to his son-in-law, the oboist Redmond Simpson, who'd married Dubourg's daughter Elizabeth in 1753. Born in Galway in around 1730, Simpson is believed to have been a member of the band of music of the Coldstream Guards, 8 civilian musicians who were hired by the month by officers of the regiment to provide music for the changing of the guard at St. James's Palace. Like his father-in-law, Dubourg, Simpson went on to divide his professional life between many activities, having in effect a portfolio career, working in London theatre orchestras and at pleasure gardens such as Vauxhall, as a professional music copyist, as a kettle drummer to the Horse Guards, and was, as we saw earlier, a member of the Queen's band of musicians, as well as her music librarian. In fact, Simpson had reportedly been one of a group of musicians sent to northern Germany to accompany the princess from her home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz to England prior to her marriage to George III in 1761. An anecdote published immediately after Simpson's death recalls how the Queen insisted he be given a regular position in her private band, despite initially being omitted because he was thought to be a Roman Catholic. As Simpson's career progressed, he became increasingly important as a fixer in London's public and private music scenes. including playing a major role in organising the finances for the Handel commemoration concerts of the 1780s, managing bookings for the new Freemasons Hall, where concerts were regularly held, including a series hosted by the Academy of Ancient Music in the 1780s. And I should just say that Simpson was a member of the Somerset House Masonic Lodge, and chairing meetings of the Royal Society of Musicians. At the time of his death, at his home in Westminster in January 1787, Simpson was described in print as having been, for many years, the first performer on the oboe in this kingdom. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. Simpson's will shows him to have left an estate worth at least £5,200 and included legacies gifted to 9 individuals ranging from £100 to £200, plus the income from 3 separate investments of £700 each to 3 women, one of whom, May Elizabeth Douglas, the wife of Archibald Douglas of Dublin, was also bequeathed the residue of Simpson's personal estate. All his music, manuscript and printed, was left to the composer Samuel Arnold. Simpson's wife, Dubourg's daughter Elizabeth, from whom Simpson had become estranged, was granted the income from a sum of £2,000 reduced 3% by bank annuities. Strikingly, at least 2 of Simpson's legatees considered this amount insufficient to support her, as was made clear in an anonymous letter published in 1789. Describing Elizabeth Simpson as a decent, inoffensive woman, the only child of the celebrated Dubourg, the writer claimed that although Simpson died rich, he left his widow, with whom he had not lived for many years, in such indigent circumstances that Mr. William Sharp, surgeon, and Dr. Jebb generously gave up each their £100 legacy in order to render Mrs. Simpson's condition more tolerable. The author went on to note that it is singular that this man acquired a tolerable taste in painting and had collected a number of very good pictures, some of considerable value, which he sold to Mr. Bowes, but not to be delivered till after his death. In addition to the paintings that Simpson sold to Mr. Bowes, he's also known to have donated portraits of Handel, Corelli, Gemignani, and Purcell to the Royal Society of Musicians. Some of them remain in their collection to this very day, and these had initially been linked to the Academy of Ancient Music. As had been the case with Dubourg, an auction was also held following Simpson's death. Here's a transcription of the newspaper advertisement for it, and you'll see that this event was also run by Christie's in London. The extant catalogue, now held by the National Gallery Library, London, indicates that the auction featured 81 books, 11 paintings, 17 prints, and 117 items of household furniture and other effects. Unfortunately, unlike Dubourg's auction, the sums raised are not recorded. In conclusion, it's clear that both Dubourg and Redmond Simpson were successful enough in their chosen career as a musician to have accumulated a reasonable amount of wealth by the time of their deaths. And while, at least from the evidence available to me at the current time, neither appears to have been anywhere near as wealthy as Handel in 1759, and he was reportedly worth some £20,000, like him, both Dubourg and Simpson seem to have lived as gentlemen, titling themselves Esquire and mixing frequently with gentry, nobility, and royalty. Furthermore, like those aristocrats, they engaged actively in assembling sizable and serious art collections. Furthermore, their abundant musical talents facilitated their contact with members of the upper classes, not only through their appointments at court, but also in private music making with gentlemen amateurs, such as the Percival brothers, in their homes and as participants in organised music clubs. It's also worth highlighting here that, as was the case for Handel, both Dubourg and Simpson regularly performed in concerts raising money for a variety of charities, including involvement with societies for so-called decayed musicians in both Ireland and England, what was to eventually become the Royal Society of Musicians. And I've just got two examples on this slide from one year, 1751. So on the left from London, and you'll see Dubourg starts part 2 with a concerto composed and performed by Mr. Dubourg, and then an announcement that a charitable society is set on foot in Dublin after the manner of that Society for Decayed Musicians in London. As both Deborah Raw and Simon McVeigh have rightly noted, there is no way of assessing accurately the financial circumstances of any one 18th century musician. It's clearly difficult, if not impossible, to estimate earnings from teaching or concert giving, for example, activities for which documentation generally no longer exists. Despite such difficulties, however, Handel's economic position has been thoroughly interrogated by a number of scholars, including Alan T. Harris and David Hunter. And with the increasing amount of data now available online, including searchable newspapers, wills, auction records, and the like, perhaps it is now time to attempt similar research for lesser-known figures such as Dubourg and Simpson, to enable the emergence of a more in-depth picture of the economic circumstances of a wider cross-section of professional musicians active in the 18th century. And thank you very much for listening, and please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions or comments. I'd really love to hear from you.